Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
Anti-government protests in Indonesia have turned violent after police killed a 21-year-old delivery driver. The protests began in the capital city of Jakarta, sparked by outrage over politicians' pay. They have now spread across the country, resulting in at least 7 deaths and more than 1,200 arrests. In today's podcast, we'll explain what sparked these protests and what the Indonesian government plans to do next.
Lucy, we're talking about these protests in Indonesia today.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I started to see this story on social media about a week ago, and then within a few days, it had really escalated.
Yeah.
What started all of this?
Yeah, so this all began about 2 weeks ago when Indonesian media reported that federal politicians in Indonesia had been getting a monthly housing allowance from the federal government.
Okay.
And the government's rationale for this allowance is that in this term of parliament, which began last year, long-term listeners to this podcast will remember how much we talked about how many different countries were having huge elections in 2024. Indonesia was one of them. And so from the beginning of this term that began last year, the government isn't providing housing for MPs as it has done in the past. So they're not saying here's a place where you can live if you've been elected to parliament.
So previously elected officials got a house.
Yeah, or an apartment or something like that. Their argument was, we're not giving people a place to live this time. We're paying for them to find their own home in the capital city of Jakarta.
Okay. So is this common practice? Is it usual for governments in Indonesia or around the world anywhere to kind of provide accommodation for MPs or provide financial means to pay for their accommodation?
I'd say it's fairly common. I can tell you about what happens in Australia.
Yeah.
In Australia, MPs can claim an allowance for the nights that they stay in Canberra each year. Mm-hmm. They get that allowance and then they can choose how they spend it. I think they sort of claim it at the end of the year.
Okay.
Some MPs choose to rent. Some might own properties in Canberra, although I would say that tends to be more people who've been in Parliament a really long time and don't anticipate that will change anytime soon. Mm-hmm. So that's people like Labor MP Tanya Plibersek, who from her declaration of interests in the parliamentary system, which all MPs have to do, we know that she owns a residential property in Canberra. It's understandable. She's been in Parliament since 1998 and she has an incredibly safe Labor seat in Sydney.
Yeah.
There's a similar system in New Zealand, and just for something closer to Indonesia, in Malaysia, MPs can use either government-provided housing or the allowance system.
Okay.
So Indonesia moving to this system brings it in line with other governments in the Australasian Oceania region. Mm-hmm. But that is not really what sparked the protests.
Okay. So then the protests become about the issue of how much the Indonesian MPs are getting for this allowance.
Yeah.
How significant is it?
I'm going to say a lot of numbers in the next few minutes, and I just want everyone to stay with me. I promise I'll get you through.
Thank you for flagging.
If I can understand this maths, I promise anyone can. Mm-hmm. So there are 580 members of Indonesia's lower house, the House of Representatives. They are being paid each as much as 50 million Indonesian rupiah for housing expenses every month. For context, that's around 4,700 Australian dollars.
Okay, so hang on, just to recap. MPs in Indonesia are getting about 4.5 grand Aussie dollars per month for their living expenses, housing expenses.
For their housing expenses,
Got it.
Yes. Now, I mentioned a second ago that Australian MPs can claim an allowance for how long they're staying in Canberra for official business. Australian MPs can claim about $320 a night for each night that they stay in Canberra. This year, the Australian lower house, the House of Representatives, is meant to sit for around 40 days. That works out to be about 12,700 Australian dollars that MPs can claim in housing expenses, assuming they stay 40 nights for the 40 days. So each of those nights being around $320. Maybe they claim a couple on either side of sitting weeks. That is a far cry from a monthly allowance of 4.5 grand, which over the course of a whole year works out to be about $56,000 Australian dollars.
But that's an allowance kind of assuming or permitting MPs in Indonesia to stay in Jakarta full time, whereas the Aussie allowance system is set up to pay for politicians to be in Canberra during sitting periods.
Yes.
So $318 a night being that allowance if pollies were in Canberra full time, I'm sure that would amount to thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yes. I'll also mention that this housing allowance makes up about half of the total remuneration for Indonesian MPs.
Okay.
Aussie MPs, this is on top of what they already get paid, which can range from 200 grand to closer to 600 grand, depending on their level of seniority.
Yeah.
So a lot of numbers there. The crucial thing, though, the crucial number that you really need to know is that the thing that incited the initial protests is that the monthly housing allowance is 10 times the monthly minimum wage in the city of Jakarta.
Yep.
That's Indonesia's capital where the parliament sits. So that is what has kind of sparked these protests, is this idea that just to be in the city, the 580 MPs are getting paid 10 times the monthly minimum wage for everyone else in the city.
Yeah, I think that's a really important figure, because when you hear that total Indonesian MP's salary sits at around 100,000 Aussie dollars, that may sound like a lot, but considering Aussie MPs are paid more like 200 grand at a minimum, I also think it's important to flag the cost of living is different in Indonesia.
Yeah.
It is in many respects, developing country.
Yeah.
So what might sound like maybe to some Australians like a not extremely impressive salary, obviously we know that it is 10 times the monthly minimum wage in Jakarta.
Yeah, exactly.
So Lucy, I understand now where these protests have come from, but what do we know about the initial action? Where did it start and how did things escalate?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
We know that it's centred in Jakarta around the Parliament building. We know that student groups were involved, and we know that police were firing tear gas at crowds and crowds were throwing rocks and bottles at police. There's differing reports as to who incited that kind of exchange.
Yep.
We also know that several politicians' homes were looted and attacked in Jakarta. Again, that's would be this kind of site that you would go to if you were protesting against the housing allowance, right? You would go to the home that's being paid for out of the taxpayer dollars. You can understand that logic. I should also note that the housing allowance announcement came soon after the Indonesian government handed down its budget, which included some funding cuts.
Right.
So the finance minister's home could also be, it explains why that was a target.
Okay, so we can assume that there is this public outrage over the housing allowance, also at a sensitive time around budget cuts and, shifting priorities in the government's spending.
Yes. So again, these first few days of protests, they're contained to the capital city, but that changed when police killed a delivery driver near the protests.
That, Lucy, strikes me as quite an escalation.
Yeah.
What happened?
So last Thursday, a 21-year-old motorbike delivery driver named Afan Kurniawan was near the site of a protest when he was run over by an armoured police vehicle.
Was he involved in the protest at this point?
It's not believed that he was involved at the protest.
Okay, so he just happened to be passing by on a motorbike.
Yes. The incident then it made the protest explode basically across the whole country, and it also led to protests being against the presence of the military and police behaviour in day-to-day life in Indonesia.
Right.
This also was kind of a flashpoint because Indonesia has very high rates of informal employment. That's according to the World Bank, and forms of informal employment we know include things like being a delivery driver. So that made this particularly relevant to protesters.
Yeah.
And following this, these protests turned violent. There have been several deaths, including 3 people who were killed when a city council building was set alight. Hundreds of people have been injured and more than 1,200 people have been arrested.
So what started as a protest about this housing allowance scheme has kind of evolved into a much bigger picture protest movement about military powers, law enforcement, police presence, and broader kind of government policy in Indonesia. Is that right?
Yes. And all these kind of interconnected issues. Obviously we know that the police are kind of a manifestation of the government that exist in the community. They enforce laws. And so if you're angry at police, you're also kind of angry at the government, and people were already angry at the government. So it was kind of this perfect storm of issues. An interesting point that I'll raise that came up in my research of this topic was from researchers at the University of Melbourne, who have suggested that while the protests are very much real and organic, some of the violence that's resulted was manufactured, that's their suggestion, by wealthy Indonesians loyal to the former president, Joko Widodo, who are trying to undermine the new president who was elected last year, Prabowo Subianto. So that's their allegation.
Right. So on top of all of this, there is this alleged conspiracy, a political conspiracy, essentially.
Yeah.
How has the new president responded to these protests?
He cancelled a planned trip to China. He was going to go to this military parade in China marking the end of World War II. He's also met with the family of the delivery driver who police killed, and he's called for a full investigation into the incident. And the latest update is that on Monday, he said he would scrap the housing allowance that sparked all of this.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
So that's gone.
That's gone now. The protests have also cooled off, but as we know, this is such a complex issue. Something else could trigger more action. We're just going to have to keep tabs on it.
Yeah, I suppose it's one thing for the housing allowance to be resolved in a sense, but clearly there is unrest and disappointment amongst Indonesians about how a lot of aspects to day-to-day governing are being handled.
Yeah, totally.
Lucy, thank you so much for explaining that to us. A very complicated one, but we appreciate you taking us through it.
Thanks, Emma.
And thank you for listening to today's episode. We'll be back a little later on with your evening news headlines, but until then, have a great day.